History often remembers tyrants through their speeches, their symbols, and their crimes. But the most revealing truths about power rarely come from the men who held it. They come from those who stood closest, close enough to hear the unfiltered words, to witness the private doubts, and to see the moment belief curdled into madness. When the Third Reich collapsed, Adolf Hitler left behind no confession, no reckoning, no final explanation. But one man did. A man who had sat beside him through years of war, who had signed his orders, who had obeyed him until the very end. And when that man finally spoke, what he revealed was not loyalty, but exposure. This is not the story of Hitler's last days. This is the story of how Hitler looked when the war was already lost, seen through the eyes of the man who served him longest. I call upon God Almighty to show mercy to the German people. More than 2 million German soldiers have gone to their deaths for the fatherland before me. I now follow my sons, all for Germany. These were among the final words spoken by Wilhelm Keitel, moments before the hangman's noose closed around his neck on October 16, 1946. The sentence ended his life, but it did not end his importance. Because in the long months between the collapse of Nazi Germany and his execution, Keitel gave the world something far more valuable than a last declaration. He revealed Adolf Hitler. For years, Wilhelm Keitel had occupied a position no other man held. As the highest-ranking officer in Hitler's military hierarchy, he stood beside the Führer during virtually every major decision of the Second World War. He attended thousands of conferences. He watched Hitler's violent rages, his bursts of irrational confidence, his detachment from reality as the war turned against Germany. And when the Allies finally captured him, Keitel began to speak. What did the man closest to Hitler's military apparatus truly believe about him? What did he say when fear, loyalty, and ambition no longer mattered? And did defeat finally strip away the illusions that had bound him to the dictator for so long? To understand what Keitel revealed about Hitler, one must first understand who Keitel was and why his words carried such weight. Born in 1882 in the small village of Helmscherode in the German Empire, Wilhelm Keitel came from a family of modest landowners. He chose a professional military career, serving as an artillery officer during the First World War, where he was wounded on the Western Front. In the years that followed Germany's defeat, he remained in the drastically reduced Reichswehr, the army permitted under the Treaty of Versailles, rising steadily but quietly through its ranks. His true ascent came in 1938. Adolf Hitler personally selected Keitel to lead the newly created Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the high command of the armed forces. The appointment placed Keitel at the absolute center of Nazi military power. From that moment until Germany's surrender 7 years later, he was present at nearly every decisive strategic discussion. He signed orders that sent millions into combat. He approved directives that would later be classified as crimes against humanity. Yet Keitel was not chosen for brilliance. Hitler selected him precisely because he was compliant, obedient, unquestioning. Other generals privately ridiculed him, calling him Lake Idol, a cruel pun suggesting a lackey rather than a leader. Even Hitler reportedly mocked him, once remarking that Keitel had the brains of a cinema usher. So why does his testimony matter? Because Keitel was always there. While more independent commanders were dismissed, sidelined, or openly defied, Keitel remained. Through early victories, through turning points, and through catastrophic collapse, he witnessed events that others only learned of secondhand. When Allied interrogators finally sat across from him in May 1945, they were not questioning a military genius. They were questioning a man who had spent 7 years watching Adolf Hitler at arm's length, and who now had nothing left to protect except his version of history. On the morning of May 13, 1945, Wilhelm Keitel was a man unmoored. Nazi Germany no longer existed. Hitler was dead by suicide in his Berlin bunker. The so-called Flensburg government under Admiral Karl Dönitz, which had briefly claimed authority after Hitler's death, was disintegrating. Only days earlier, Keitel had signed the unconditional surrender of all German forces at Soviet headquarters in Karlshorst in the early hours of May 9th. He had entered the room with theatrical dignity, even defiance, raising his field marshal's baton as he crossed the threshold. But the gesture rang hollow. Everything did. When British forces took him into custody, witnesses noted his lack of emotion. He appeared almost relieved. For weeks he had existed in a strange limbo, wearing the uniform of a field marshal, performing the rituals of authority, yet commanding nothing. Now even that illusion was gone. The Allies transferred Keitel through several holding facilities before bringing him to the Palace Hotel in Mondorf-les-Bains, Luxembourg. Once an elegant retreat, it had been transformed by the Americans into a detention center for captured Nazi leaders, informally known as Ashkan. There, Keitel found himself among former colleagues, men who had once shaped the fate of Europe and now controlled nothing at all. Göring, Ribbentrop, Speer, dozens of others. The accommodations were tolerable. The psychological impact was not. These men were watched constantly, interrogated relentlessly, and forced to confront a world that no longer saw them as statesmen or commanders, but as criminals. It was here that Keitel's interrogations began, and it was here that he started to describe the man who had led Germany into ruin. Allied intelligence officers approached Keitel with clear goals. They wanted military information, strategy, deployments, weapons programs, but they also wanted something harder to capture: insight into how the Nazi system actually functioned, how decisions were made, who truly held power, and above all, who Adolf Hitler really was behind the spectacle and propaganda. Keitel proved unexpectedly open. Perhaps he believed cooperation might improve his situation. Perhaps he was simply relieved to speak without fear. Or perhaps, as some historians suggest, he wanted history to understand what had happened, even if that understanding would damn him. In his earliest statements, Keitel painted a portrait of Hitler that was familiar yet disturbingly intimate. He described a leader who trusted almost no one, who deliberately pitted subordinates against each other, who demanded absolute loyalty while offering little in return. Hitler, Keitel said, possessed an extraordinary memory for technical detail. Weapon specifications, factory output figures, terrain maps of distant fronts. He could recall conversations from years earlier with unsettling clarity, and yet this same man was intellectually rigid to a fault. Once Hitler formed an opinion, altering it was nearly impossible. Contradictory intelligence was dismissed as defeatism. Disagreement was treated as betrayal. Over time, fewer and fewer officers dared to present unwelcome truths. The Führer lived in a world of his own making, Keitel told his interrogators. Maps and reports showed him what he wanted to see. Those of us who knew better learned to remain silent. It was a staggering admission. Hitler's highest-ranking military officer was acknowledging that the German High Command had effectively stopped challenging its leader, even when they knew his decisions were leading Germany toward destruction. When pressed further, Keitel described the poisonous atmosphere inside Hitler's inner circle. Hitler viewed professional officers with deep suspicion, blaming them for failures that often stemmed from his own orders. After the July 1944 assassination attempt, that suspicion hardened into paranoia. From that day, Keitel stated, the Führer saw enemies everywhere within the officer corps. Trust became impossible. In November 1945, the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg opened proceedings against 22 major Nazi figures. Keitel sat among them, charged with crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The evidence was overwhelming. His signature appeared on orders responsible for untold suffering. But Nuremberg gave Keitel something new: a permanent public record. His defense rested on a single claim: obedience. He argued that he had merely followed orders, that responsibility lay with Hitler, who was no longer alive to answer for them. The tribunal rejected this defense outright. But in making it, Keitel exposed Hitler's system of rule. He described a command structure designed to concentrate authority in one man while dispersing blame among many. Orders were often intentionally vague. Chains of command overlapped. No subordinate was ever allowed to accumulate independent power. The Führer's will was law, Keitel testified. Not German law, not international law, his will alone. When asked why he had not resigned, his answers faltered. He spoke of duty, of patriotism, of fear. He admitted that he had considered resignation, but lacked the courage to act. In one of his most revealing statements, Keitel explained when he realized the war was truly lost. It was not after a single defeat. It was when he understood that Hitler would never accept peace, only total victory, long after victory was impossible. The war continued, Keitel said, not because it could be won, but because Hitler could not admit failure. And beyond the military details, what most fascinated both interrogators and observers was Keitel's psychological portrait of Adolf Hitler, a man who would rather see Germany destroyed than accept defeat. Here was a man who had lived for years in the immediate orbit of one of the most scrutinized figures in human history, What had he witnessed that others never saw? What truths emerged only when power vanished and silence finally broke? Wilhelm Keitel's reflections presented Adolf Hitler as a figure defined by contradiction. At times, Hitler could be unexpectedly magnetic. He was capable of warmth, even courtesy, when it suited him. He remembered the names of officers' children, inquired about their families, and possessed an unsettling ability to make visitors feel singled out, understood, chosen, indispensable. Keitel believed this personal charm explained how Hitler sustained loyalty even among men who privately questioned his judgment. But the transformation could come without warning. Keitel described Hitler's rages as something far more terrifying than theatrical displays. They were violent eruptions, raw, uncontrolled, and deeply unsettling. In these moments, Hitler screamed accusations, slammed his fists against tables, and threatened ruin for those he suspected of failure or disloyalty. Officers learned to fear bringing bad news. Reports of setbacks were sometimes delayed, not out of deception, but desperation. Hope that circumstances might improve before they had to face the Führer's fury. More disturbing than the rages, Keitel explained, was Hitler's growing separation from reality as the war entered its final years. Entire army groups were dismissed with a gesture. Divisions that no longer existed were ordered to attack. Fantasies of secret weapons and miraculous reversals replaced sober assessments. Attempts to correct these illusions were met with accusations of defeatism or treason. I sometimes wondered whether the Führer understood what he was ordering, Keitel reflected. The maps showed positions that no longer existed. The units existed only on paper, yet the orders continued, as if reality itself had not changed. Keitel also spoke openly of Hitler's physical decline. The tremor in his left hand worsened steadily. His posture collapsed inward. His skin grew pale and unhealthy. The man who had once strode confidently before roaring crowds now shuffled through bunker corridors, visibly aged beyond his years. Keitel attributed this decay to exhaustion, sleeplessness, and the heavy regimen of medications prescribed by Hitler's personal physician. And yet, even diminished, Hitler's psychological dominance remained intact. To stand in his presence, Keitel insisted, was still to feel the gravitational pull of his personality. Weakened, perhaps, but never extinguished. Fear of punishment mattered less than the force of belief he inspired. That, Keitel suggested, was why so many continued to follow him long after hope had vanished. Although Keitel consistently portrayed himself as an executor rather than a decision-maker, his testimony revealed unmistakable criticism of Hitler's military leadership. For a man long derided for unquestioning obedience, these judgments were strikingly direct. The invasion of the Soviet Union, Keitel admitted, had been launched against the warnings of several senior officers who feared Germany could not survive a prolonged two-front war. Hitler dismissed these concerns, convinced the Soviet system would collapse like a house of cards. When that prediction proved catastrophically wrong, he refused to adapt. Keitel described how Hitler increasingly inserted himself into tactical decisions that should have belonged to commanders in the field. He pored over maps for hours, issuing instructions for specific divisional movements hundreds of miles away. Generals who attempted independent judgment were overruled or removed. The result was the systematic destruction of one of Germany's traditional strengths, operational flexibility. Stalingrad became the clearest symbol of this failure. As the Sixth Army faced encirclement and annihilation, Hitler forbade retreat. Withdrawal, Keitel explained, would puncture the myth of invincibility. But deeper still was Hitler's inability to surrender territory once taken. He believed willpower could overcome logistics. That belief itself could replace arithmetic. When reality proved otherwise, he blamed weakness in others, not error in himself. After July 1944, this mindset hardened into obsession. The assassination attempt convinced Hitler that his generals were betraying him. Professional advice was discarded. His intuition reigned supreme. Conferences became monologues. Defeats were redefined as strategic opportunities. Germany, he insisted, was growing stronger even as its armies collapsed. Keitel admitted he often sat through these meetings in silent despair, fully aware of the truth, fully aware that speaking it would change nothing except seal his own fate. By the spring of 1945, as Soviet forces closed in, Hitler withdrew into the underground bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. Keitel was among those who moved between that sealed world and the ruins above. His account of Hitler's final weeks remains among the most chilling testimony to emerge from Nuremberg. Inside the bunker, reality fractured. While Berlin burned overhead, routines continued with eerie normality. Daily conferences were held. Meals arrived on schedule. Eva Braun hosted small gatherings. Hitler presided over discussions involving armies that no longer existed and offensives that would never come. Beneath this surface, Keitel sensed something deeply wrong. Hitler swung violently between resignation and manic optimism, sometimes within the same conversation. He spoke calmly of death one moment, then outlined future campaigns the next. The boundary between reality and delusion had collapsed. Keitel recalled a meeting where Hitler shifted divisions across a map that had been destroyed weeks earlier. When a staff officer hesitantly pointed this out, Hitler erupted, accusing the military of deception, conspiracy, and betrayal. The tirade lasted nearly an hour. Afterward, silence. No one corrected him again. As the end approached, Hitler's thinking turned openly nihilistic. He spoke of the German people themselves as unworthy of survival. If Germany could not win, then Germany deserved to perish. Cities, culture, and lives were expendable. His fate and the nation's fate had fused into one. If I must fall, Keitel reflected, then Germany must fall with me. This thinking crystallized in the Nero Decree of March 1945, ordering the destruction of German infrastructure to deny it to the enemy. Hitler believed a defeated nation had no need for bridges, factories, or railways. Keitel admitted transmitting the order while privately hoping it would be ignored. Hope that proved justified in many cases. At Nuremberg, one of the most consequential questions concerned Keitel's knowledge of atrocities. Documents bearing his signature authorized brutal treatment of prisoners and civilians. He acknowledged signing them. He could not deny that. His defense shifted between ignorance and paralysis. He portrayed himself as an administrator trapped in a system where questioning orders was impossible. Critics found this unconvincing. Keitel had been no distant bureaucrat. He had sat in Hitler's inner circle. Claims of ignorance rang hollow. Under pressure, he offered a different explanation: moral surrender. He admitted subordinating conscience to command, signing orders he knew were wrong, remaining silent when silence made him complicit. "I know now what I should have done," Keitel said. "I should have refused. I should have resigned. I did not." In prison, as execution approached, Keitel wrote extensively, attempting to shape his legacy. The writings revealed a man still entangled in contradiction. He acknowledged catastrophe while clinging to admiration for Hitler's early successes. He blamed himself, yet deflected responsibility. Even at the end, he could not fully break free. On October 16, 1946, Wilhelm Keitel was executed. His death was prolonged and undignified. His body was cremated. His ashes were scattered in secret. So what did Keitel ultimately reveal about Adolf Hitler? He revealed a leader whose charisma masked delusion, a command system built to absorb blame and concentrate power, a mind that mistook willpower for strategy and fantasy for reality. But more importantly, Keitel revealed how tyranny functions. Hitler did not act alone. He required men like Wilhelm Keitel, men who translated obsession into orders, loyalty into action, and doubt into silence. That is the true lesson of Keitel's testimony. Not simply who Hitler was, but how ordinary obedience enables extraordinary evil.